Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the trade war between the USA and China and talk about the implications not just on the US economy and the Chinese economy, but also the global economy and potentially world peace. Now, that sounds like a big statement, but the Chinese embassy recently came out and posted on X saying if war is what the US wants, be it a tariff war, a trade war, or any other type of war, we're ready to fight until the end. Now, obviously, the last thing that anybody wants at the moment is another potential war. And whilst this is only words coming out of the Chinese embassy, we saw recently in the meeting with President Zelensky from Ukraine that Donald Trump and JD Vance are unlikely to back down if anybody threatens them. So what we've got here is China throwing down the gauntlet saying, we'll take you on in any sort of war that you like. And I don't think they want to be doing that at the moment because President Trump and his team are in full-on aggression mode right now. They are taking on all comers. So the last thing that we need to see is the war of words between China and the USA actually escalating into some sort of potential conflict. Now, hopefully that won't happen, and that's not what I'm going to go into detail about in today's video. I'm going to look at the tariffs that have been applied by China against US imports and talk about what the potential impact is going to be, not just on the USA, but also on the Chinese economy, which I'm sure you'll be aware if you follow the channel, is struggling right now to keep hitting its target of 5% growth that it's set for 2025. Now, before we go on any further today, I want to talk to you about Ground News, who I've been working with for the past 2.5 years and who I've partnered with for today's video. And they're offering Joe Blogs viewers an exclusive 40% discount on their Vantage plan, which is what I use. And what's brilliant about Ground News is that they're a news aggregator. They bring together stories from all around the world. And if we look at the articles that Ground News has pulled together, talking about China's threat to fight to the end against the USA, you can see that they've located 138 different articles. And what's brilliant about Ground News is that they tell you the political bias of those media outlets, whether they lean to the left, to the right, or come from the centre, which is really important to me when I'm trying to provide a balanced viewpoint. And Ground News are offering Joe Blogs viewers a 40% discount on the Vantage plan, which you can access by scanning the QR code on the screen now or clicking in the link in the description below. Before we go on to look at the specifics on the Chinese tariffs on US imports, I thought it was worth having a look at that post that the Chinese embassy released recently on X. On the 5th of March, the Chinese embassy in the USA posted saying, "The fentanyl issue is a flimsy excuse to raise US tariffs on Chinese imports. Our countermeasures to defend our rights and interests are fully legitimate and necessary. The US, not anybody else, is responsible for the fentanyl crisis inside the US. In the spirit of humanity and goodwill towards the American people, we have taken robust steps to assist the US in dealing with the issue. Instead of recognising our efforts, the US has sought to smear and shift blame to China and is seeking to pressure and blackmail China with tariff hikes. They've been punishing us for helping them. This is not going to solve the US's problem and will undermine our counter-narcotics dialogue and cooperation. Intimidation does not scare us. Bullying does not work on us. Pressuring, coercion or threats are not the right way of dealing with China. Anyone using maximum pressure on China is picking the wrong guy and miscalculating. If the US truly wants to solve the fentanyl issue, then the right thing to do is to consult with China by treating each other as equals. If war is what the US wants, be it a tariff war, a trade war, or any other type of war, we're ready to fight till the end." Now, that is obviously a very punchy statement. Firstly, China is saying that the fentanyl problem is absolutely nothing to do with them. They've been doing things to help the US, so they're saying that the US is ungrateful. They're saying that the US hasn't said thank you, and that sort of rings a bell with me in terms of that meeting between President Zelensky and Donald Trump in the White House. There was a lot of questions about why haven't you said thank you. So the US is sort of getting it reversed on itself here by China. But more importantly, China have finished off that by saying, don't pick a fight with China. You're picking on the wrong guys. If you want to go to war, then we're ready to go. And that really is quite incendiary conversation. That is the sort of thing that sparks up into retaliation. I'm surprised that Donald Trump hasn't already posted a reply to this on his Truth Social site. Maybe he has by the time I posted this video. Maybe he's already come out and said something in response. But what we've got here is a war of words that potentially could escalate into something much worse. Fingers crossed it doesn't. Fingers crossed it just goes away. But what we are seeing here is China is refusing to back down in the face of what it considers to be bullying. It thinks that the USA is bullying it in terms of hitting all of its exports into the US with additional tariffs. And so obviously China has come out and retaliated, but they've also come out and said, don't threaten us, you're picking on the wrong guy, we are ready for war. And obviously I don't think that's particularly smart at the current time, given everything else that's going on in the world. As I said at the start of today's video, Donald Trump hit China with additional tariffs of 10% on all of its imports into the USA at the beginning of February, and then doubled down on that at the beginning of March. So everything that's now being imported from China has an additional tariff of 20%, and that's on top of the 25% tariff that Donald Trump introduced for a lot of Chinese imports during his first presidency. And also, if you follow the channel, you'll be aware that Chinese electric vehicles have been hit with a 100% tariff. So lots of different products coming from China are now a lot more expensive in the USA. And in retaliation to that, China has now announced that it's imposing additional tariffs on over $21 billion worth of imports from the USA to China. This table shows the breakdown of the US products being exported into China that have now been hit with additional tariffs. So if we look at the products that have been hit with a 15% tariff first, you can see that there are 4 different product groups that will now be 15% more expensive in China. And they are cotton, which last year had a total export value for the USA of just under $1.5 billion. Wheat, where the export value was $560 million. Chicken and offal, which had an export value of $478 million. And corn with a value of $336 million. And between them, the total value of these 4 product groups in 2024 in terms of the exports from the USA was just under $2.9 billion. And if we now look at the products that have been hit with a 10% increase, the largest of these was soybean, where the export value was $12.76 billion in 2024 for the USA. Beef and offal exports was the second largest with a value of $1.55 billion, followed by sorghum, which is an animal feed product, where the total value was $1.26 billion, aquatic products with $1.14 billion, pork and offal with $993 million, and the last 2 categories are fruit, where the US exported $306 million, and dairy, where it exported $298 million. And the total export value in 2024 of all of these products that have now been hit with an additional 10% tariff was $18.3 billion. And of course, the immediate impact of these additional tariffs is that US imports into China are now going to be more expensive. So that means that Chinese consumers are likely to start shopping around and maybe will prefer to buy other products. And China as a country is more likely to start sourcing product from elsewhere. So it might get more soybean from Brazil, for example, and therefore US businesses that are currently exporting tens of millions, hundreds of millions, potentially billions of dollars worth of product every single year to China are going to lose that business. They may lose a percentage of it, or potentially they could lose all of that business. And some of these exports are things that US consumers simply don't want. So China value things like chicken feet and pork ears. They use those products in their food chain. In the USA, that is waste product. That would just get thrown away. Nobody is eating chicken feet and pork ears apart from maybe animals in the USA. So this is a valuable source of exports for a lot of US businesses. And what we're seeing here is these tariffs are going to make the imports from the USA less attractive, and Chinese businesses and consumers are likely to start shopping around elsewhere. So what we are seeing here is a change in the supply chain and potentially a sea change in terms of the trading relationship between the USA and China. And that's going to be really bad news for all of those US businesses that are making lots of profits at the moment from all of those exports. In addition to the increased tariffs on a variety of agricultural products, the Chinese authorities have also banned the import of all USA lumber. On the 4th of March, Chinese Customs issued a press release which stated, "Recently, China Customs has detected quarantine forest pests such as bark beetles and long-haul beetles in imported logs from the United States. In order to prevent the introduction of harmful organisms and to protect my country's agricultural and forestry production and ecological security, in accordance with the Law of the People's Republic of China on biosafety, Law of the People's Republic of China on entry and exit animal and plant quarantine, and its implementing regulations, international standards for phytosanitary measures and other relevant regulations, the General Administration of Customs has decided to suspend the import of logs from the date of this announcement." And just to put that into monetary terms, in 2024 the US exported over $850 million worth of lumber directly to China. So in terms of what the impact of these additional tariffs is going to have on the Chinese economy, let's firstly talk about Chinese exports, because the Chinese economy is predominantly a manufacturing economy. It makes lots of things and exports them all around the world. So a lot of the profit in China from Chinese companies is coming from selling things for its exports. So if those exports are now going to be more expensive, then you would think that they will sell less, they'll make less profit, and so those companies will deliver less profitability and therefore pay less tax, and so the Chinese economy will start to suffer. This chart shows the country breakdown of where China is selling its exports, and as you can see, the biggest single market for Chinese companies is the USA, representing 15% of all of the goods exported, which equated in 2024 to more than $500 billion. So taking that figure of $500 billion that China exported to the USA, if you apply a 20% additional tariff, so you increase that price by 20%, that $500 billion worth of goods will now be selling in the USA for $600 billion. And that's quite a considerable price increase. When you consider that inflation is running at less than 5%, a 20% hike is obviously considerably more than general price rises. So what that will mean is that Chinese goods will now be more expensive than they were. And if a lot of consumers were only buying Chinese goods because they were cheaper, they were just getting it because it was the lowest price. If those prices are now comparable with other goods, then US consumers may decide that they no longer want to buy the Chinese goods and that they will buy an alternative. And so Chinese businesses will definitely see a fall in their revenue. They will see a reduction in the volume of sales, and therefore they'll get less return, they will make less profit, and so those businesses will be generating less profit in China, they'll pay less tax, and therefore the Chinese economy will definitely suffer. And as I've talked about in many other videos, we have seen month-on-month reductions in factory gate prices in China for over 2 years. So Chinese companies are already selling their products at a lower price today than they were 2 years ago. And what we may see here is that many of these companies might have to cut their prices further. So they may actually cut their sales price by 20% to offset this additional tariff so that they can still sell at the same price on the shelves in the USA. But clearly that would be bad news for those Chinese businesses. And this is one of the reasons why China has retaliated in terms of tariffs, because it knows that a lot of its companies are really going to suffer as a result of these additional 20% tariffs. And as we've seen, 15% of all of China's exports are going to the USA. And the problem that China has is that the volume of goods that it's producing, it's really difficult to be able to find alternative markets. The USA is the biggest single market in the world anyway, so there isn't a comparable market to be able to go to. And as I've talked about before, potentially around 50% of Chinese businesses are already making losses. So this additional 20% tariff is likely to make the situation worse, which is really bad news for those companies and very bad news for the Chinese economy. Now, as we discussed earlier, China has now increased the tariff on a variety of different imports from the USA, and that's going to have a negative impact on the Chinese economy as well. This chart shows a breakdown of the countries where China is importing its goods from, and as you can see, the largest single trading partner in terms of imports into China is also the USA. It represents a smaller percentage, it's only 7% compared with 15% for exports, but it's still the biggest single market. And in 2024, the value of those imports was over $160 billion. So what's going to happen as a result of the additional tariffs is that the price of all of those US imports is now going to increase. And obviously that's going to be bad news for Chinese consumers because they're going to see price increases. Now, interestingly, if you've been following the channel, you'll know that China has been struggling with inflation, not because it's got too much, because it hasn't got enough. And in fact, in many months over the past 2 years, it's seen deflation where prices have been going down. So the fact that US prices will go up will actually push up inflation. But this is the wrong sort of inflation because it isn't benefiting any Chinese companies. One of the problems that China has with the lack of inflation is that Chinese businesses haven't been able to increase their prices. That's one of the reasons why we've seen factory gate prices falling over the last 2 years or so. But the fact that US imports will now be more expensive doesn't help those Chinese businesses. It doesn't enable them to increase their prices. All it does is add more cost to the shopping basket for Chinese consumers. If you're buying chicken feet or pork ears, they're going to be more expensive now because they've been hit with these additional tariffs. Now, over the longer term, China may be able to change its supply chain. It may be able to go to other countries and source all of the products that it was previously getting from the USA. But in the short term, this is going to drive up inflation, it's going to drive up the cost of living, and it's going to leave Chinese consumers with less money in their pockets. And also, for any Chinese businesses that have been importing from the USA as part of their supply chain, if they've been bringing stuff in and then developing it, manufacturing it, and then selling it as their own products, obviously the cost of their raw materials has now gone up. And that's going to feed through into inflation and price increases. However, what Chinese businesses have seen over the past 2 years is that they haven't been able to pass on those cost increases. They've had to absorb them. And if that happens, what it will mean is that the higher cost of everything coming in from the USA will be absorbed by those companies and potentially increase the losses that they are already making. So the increase in the cost of US imports is going to be bad news for Chinese consumers, but also bad news for Chinese companies. And overall, this will be bad news for the Chinese economy. Now, in terms of the impact on the USA economy, let's firstly talk about US exports. This chart shows a country breakdown of US exports in 2024. And what this shows is that the two largest markets are Canada and Mexico, which both account for around 17%. But China comes in at number 3, accounting for 7.1% of all US exports in 2024. And that equated in monetary terms to more than $143 billion. And as we've just discussed, the additional tariffs that have now been applied on a variety of different products coming in from the USA by the Chinese authorities mean that those products will now be more expensive in China, and therefore it's likely that they will sell less product, so they'll get less revenue, and the US companies will therefore make less profit and generate less tax, and therefore this is bad news for the US economy. And for some of these US businesses, it could be catastrophic. If a large portion of their exports have been going to China, and suddenly they see all of those exports drying up, that could mean that those companies are struggling to be able to find new buyers, struggling to get sales, struggling to get revenue, to be able to pay their people, and we could see US businesses actually getting into serious difficulty as a result of these additional tariffs. From a big picture point of view, it's very easy to say, well, it doesn't really matter because we're going to, in the long term, benefit because US businesses will do better in the home market. But in the short term, we could see companies running out of cash, not having enough money to pay all of their people and all of their bills, and potentially getting into a very serious situation. This chart shows a country breakdown of imports into the USA in 2024. And as you can see, the USA's biggest trading partner for imports is Mexico, which represents 16% of all of the goods imported last year. However, China comes in at number 2 at 14%, and in monetary terms, that equated to more than $462 billion. So the additional 20% tariff that has now been applied to all of those Chinese imports mean that that $462 billion will now cost $554 billion. So that's going to represent a serious cost increase for a lot of people who are buying those products. And let's not forget, a lot of the Chinese imports are actually made by companies in the USA. They're not going directly onto the shelves. Companies are buying things in and then using those products, whether they've been subcontracted or whether they're raw materials, in their processes before they produce their end products. So we're going to see an increase in cost feeding through into the US economy. Some of it will be immediate. So things that are going onto the shelves that are coming directly from China will go up by 20%. And some of it will feed through over the course of the next few months as companies start to adjust their prices to reflect what's going on with their costs. But the bottom line here is that we will see an increase in prices for all of these different products. Now, Donald Trump has said that in the long term, that will be good news because it gives American businesses a chance to compete because they've been losing out historically because China have been producing things at a much lower cost. So there is some logic in that. But the problem that US consumers will have is that this is going to result in price increases. It's going to result in things costing more, and therefore inflation is likely to start going back up. And if inflation goes up, then the Fed is likely to want to bring it back down to its target level of around 2%. And if it does that, then it's going to increase interest rates. And increasing interest rates will have a detrimental impact on the US economy because it will deter companies and individuals from borrowing money because it will become more expensive. And so the return on investment, if you're thinking about investing into a new production line or expanding your facilities, it makes the equation more difficult to balance because you have to factor in higher costs, and so it might not work. So the bottom line impact of the additional tariffs on Chinese imports is that it's going to increase costs and prices in the USA, which potentially is going to be bad news for the US economy in 2025. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think the ongoing trade war between the USA and China is really bad news, not just for the USA and China, but also for the global economy, because we're talking about the two biggest players in the global economy. These two economies are the biggest by far. If you add them together, they're almost bigger than every other country in the world. So they have a huge impact in terms of what's likely to happen to the global economy in 2025. And what we've seen from today's video is that the tariffs that were announced by Donald Trump at the beginning of February and March on all Chinese imports into the USA have now been matched by tariffs that China is applying on USA exports into China. And in fact, they've even banned the import of all lumber product. This is a tactic that China uses quite frequently. When it's having issues with a certain country, it will then either launch an investigation into something or say that there's a problem with the quality, and therefore it just suspends all payments and all orders. And obviously, from a big picture point of view, as I said earlier in the video, you can match off what's happening in the two economies. It might be that some US businesses will benefit in the long term by adding the cost to these Chinese imports because it enables them to be more cost competitive. But in the short term, lots of people are going to suffer. Firstly, US consumers are going to suffer because they're going to see an increase in prices, which potentially then drives up inflation and could have really serious implications in terms of interest rates, which by definition could then slow down the growth in the US economy. But also, US businesses that have been importing from China are going to struggle because they're going to see an increase in their costs. So even though it's meant to be Chinese products that are being hit, if you're a US business that use Chinese components in your manufacturing, then you're likely to have to increase your prices, so you won't be more competitive against all of the other products. And also US consumers are going to suffer because they're going to have to pay more at the tills, and therefore they'll have less money at the end of each month. Now, China have now come out and hit the US with all of these different tariffs. And what's going to happen in terms of the US businesses that were previously exporting to China is they're going to see a reduction in their revenue and their sales, potentially in their profitability. And it might be that some of these businesses are not viable in the short term, because if you are dependent on all of that trade, all of those exports going to China, and now all of your products are 10 or 15% more expensive, then that's a problem. And we're talking about the agriculture and food industries here. So you can't just stockpile all of this stuff. If you're making lots of chicken feet, if you've got lots of chicken feet over from all of the other things that you're doing with your chickens, and you're sending millions of those to China every single week, and all of a sudden China says, actually, we don't want them anymore because they're now too expensive, nobody's buying them, what are you going to do with those chicken feet? You're not going to be able to sell them into the US. Nobody wants them, so you'll have to throw them away. So literally, all of that revenue could just be written off immediately. So a lot of US businesses will be suffering as a result of these tariffs. But the other thing that I wanted to talk about was what we mentioned right at the start of today's video. China have come out and set their stall out in terms of their response by saying, if you want to go to war, we will go to war with you. Do not bully China. We will not back down. We will take you on in any sort of fight that you want. And I don't think that's helpful to what's going on in the globe at the moment, because we've got Donald Trump and JD Vance in the White House. And those two guys are unlikely to be bullied themselves. They are quite aggressive alpha males. They don't want to be told what to do by anybody, least of all by China. And China have come out and said, don't bully us or we'll bully you. And I'm hoping that it doesn't explode into some sort of war of words that potentially could explode into something much worse. Now, fingers crossed, none of that will happen. But it doesn't help when China have come out and come back very, very aggressively in terms of their response to what's happened to Chinese imports. So the overall summary of today's video is what we are seeing is a trade war that is now erupting between the two biggest economies in the world. That is going to be bad news for both of those economies in the short term, for sure. It's going to push up prices, going to push up inflation, potentially therefore means that interest rates will go up. Could be bad news for the economy over the rest of this year. And that's probably bad news for the global economy, because if the US slows down, if China slows down, then they'll buy less from everybody else. That means that all the other economies won't be doing as well. And overall, this is bad news for everybody. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. You found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. And thank you to everyone that's supporting the channel. If you've bought me a coffee, sent me a YouTube super thanks, or signed up as a patron or a member, thank you so much. Really means a lot to me. Helps to keep me going. I'm keeping posting as much as I can. And here's something to put a smile on everybody's face.